I'm Rachel, 34 years old, and I thought I had the perfect marriage until my husband's ex-wife, Michelle, moved into our guest room for what was supposed to be a temporary 2 weeks. That was 2 years ago. What started as a compassionate gesture to help David's struggling ex became a nightmare that nearly destroyed my marriage, my home, and my sanity. The confrontation that finally ended it all happened in our living room on a rainy Thursday evening, and what Michelle said that night changed everything forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rachel Martinez, and at 34, I had finally built the life I'd always dreamed of. I own a successful marketing consulting firm here in Portland, Oregon, specializing in helping small businesses grow their digital presence. It took me nearly 8 years to build my client base from zero to over 50 regular accounts, working 16-hour days and sacrificing countless weekends to establish myself in a competitive industry. When I met David at a networking event 3 years ago, I felt like all the pieces of my life were finally falling into place. He was charming, thoughtful, and seemed to understand my drive and ambition. David worked as a software engineer for a mid-sized tech company, and we bonded over our shared love of hiking, craft beer, and old movies. He was everything I thought I wanted in a partner: stable, kind, and supportive of my business goals. David had been divorced for about a year when we met. His ex-wife Michelle had left him rather suddenly, he explained, after deciding she needed to find herself and explore life outside of marriage. They had been married for 5 years, and while there were no children involved, David admitted the divorce had been emotionally devastating for him. Michelle had moved across the country to California, and they had minimal contact, except for the occasional text about dividing remaining shared assets. I appreciated David's honesty about his past. He never spoke badly about Michelle, which I actually found attractive. It showed maturity and emotional intelligence that he could discuss his failed marriage without bitterness or anger. "She's not a bad person," he would say when the topic came up. "We just wanted different things in life. I hope she finds what she's looking for." Our relationship progressed naturally and beautifully. David was attentive without being clingy, supportive of my career without being threatened by my success, and we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. He would bring me coffee during my late work sessions, celebrate my business wins with genuine enthusiasm, and never made me feel guilty for the long hours my consulting work sometimes required. After 18 months of dating, David proposed during a weekend trip to the Oregon coast. It was perfect, simple, heartfelt, and completely us. We had a small wedding 6 months later, with close family and friends gathered at a beautiful vineyard outside Portland. My best friend Carmen was my maid of honor, and everything felt like a fairy tale beginning to our life together. We bought a house in the Hillcrest neighborhood, a charming 3-bedroom craftsman with hardwood floors, a spacious kitchen, and a converted basement that I turned into my home office. The 3rd bedroom became our guest room, decorated with neutral colors and comfortable furniture for when family or friends visited. It was our sanctuary, our fresh start together. For the first year of marriage, everything was exactly as I had hoped. David and I settled into a comfortable rhythm of work, weekend adventures, and quiet evenings at home. We hosted dinner parties, took weekend trips, and talked about our future plans. David mentioned wanting children eventually, and I was warming up to the idea, though I wanted to grow my business a bit more first. Michelle remained a distant figure from David's past. Occasionally, she would text him about some forgotten item from their shared life, or to update him on her life in California. David would mention these conversations casually, and I never felt threatened or concerned. She seemed to be building a new life, dating someone new, and moving forward, just as we were. That all changed on a cold Tuesday morning in November, almost exactly 2 years ago. I was in my home office preparing for a client presentation when David's phone rang upstairs. I could hear his voice through the ceiling, though I couldn't make out the words. The conversation went on for nearly an hour, which was unusual. David typically kept phone calls brief and to the point. When he finally came downstairs, his expression was troubled. He said, "That was Michelle. She's going through a really rough time. Her relationship in California ended badly, and she's having to move out of her apartment. She lost her job last month, and she's pretty much broke." I set down my coffee, sensing where this conversation might be heading. "I'm sorry to hear that. That sounds really stressful for her." David nodded, running his hands through his hair, something he did when he was anxious. "She's thinking about moving back to Portland. She doesn't really have anywhere else to go, and she's struggling financially. She asked if she could stay in our guest room for just a couple of weeks while she gets back on her feet and finds her own place." My immediate reaction was discomfort, but I tried to be reasonable. This was David's ex-wife, someone he had loved and shared 5 years of his life with. She was in crisis, and he felt obligated to help. I could understand the compassion behind the request, even if it made me uneasy. "How do you feel about that?" I asked carefully, not wanting to seem immediately unsupportive or jealous. "Honestly, I feel bad for her," David replied. "I know our marriage didn't work out, but she's not a terrible person. She's just lost and struggling right now. It would only be temporary, 2 weeks at most, just until she can find a job and get her own apartment." I took a deep breath, weighing my options. I could say no and risk seeming heartless and insecure, or I could agree and demonstrate trust in my husband and compassion for someone in need. At the time, choosing compassion seemed like the right thing to do. "If it's really just 2 weeks, and if it would help her get back on her feet, then I guess that would be okay," I said. "But I want to be clear about the timeline and expectations." David's face lit up with relief and gratitude. "Really? You're amazing, Rachel. I promise it'll be brief and she'll respect our space and our rules. You won't even know she's here." Famous last words, as they say. If I had known then what I know now, I would have said no immediately. I would have trusted my instincts and protected my home and my marriage. But hindsight is always clearer than the moment you're living in. 3 days later, Michelle arrived at our front door with 2 large suitcases, a laptop bag, and what she claimed were just a few essential items to get her through her temporary stay. She looked different from the photos I had seen, thinner, with shorter hair and a tired expression that made her seem vulnerable and sympathetic. "Rachel, thank you so much for letting me stay here," she said, giving me a hug that felt both grateful and slightly too familiar. "I promise I'll be the perfect houseguest. You won't even know I'm here." As I watched David help her carry her belongings to our guest room, I had my first real moment of doubt. Something about the situation felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. Maybe it was the way Michelle looked around our house with such familiarity, or the comfortable ease with which she and David interacted. Whatever it was, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that this arrangement might not be as temporary or as simple as we all hoped. But I pushed those doubts aside, determined to be the understanding wife and compassionate person I believed myself to be. After all, what could go wrong in just 2 weeks? Looking back now, I realize that question would soon be answered in ways I never could have imagined. To understand how catastrophic Michelle's presence became in our lives, you need to understand the foundation that David and I had built together. Our relationship hadn't been a whirlwind romance. It was built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine compatibility. At least, that's what I thought, until Michelle's arrival began revealing cracks I never knew existed. When David first told me about his marriage to Michelle, he painted a picture of 2 people who had simply grown apart. "We got married young," he had explained during one of our early dinner dates. "I was 26, she was 24. We thought we wanted the same things, but as we got older, it became clear we had different visions for our future. According to David, Michelle had been a free spirit who felt trapped by the conventional life they were building together. She had worked various jobs: retail, restaurant server, briefly as a yoga instructor, but never seemed to find her passion or stick with anything long term. David, meanwhile, was focused on building his career and establishing financial stability. She felt like I was too focused on practical things, David had told me. She wanted to travel the world, try living in different cities, maybe start an art therapy business someday. I wanted to buy a house, start a family, build something stable. Neither of us was wrong, we just weren't compatible anymore. The way David described their split made it sound mutual and amicable. Michelle had been the one to initiate the divorce, telling David she needed to find herself and couldn't do that while married. She had moved to California to stay with a college friend, and from what David shared, she seemed to be living the adventurous life she had always wanted. I heard she was dating an artist in San Francisco, David had mentioned once. Someone she met at a pottery class. It sounds like she's happy, and that makes me happy for her. She deserves to find what she's looking for. This mature, evolved perspective on his ex-wife had actually been one of the things that attracted me to David. My previous boyfriend had spent months bad-mouthing his ex, calling her crazy and manipulative. David's ability to speak about Michelle with kindness and understanding seemed to indicate emotional maturity and good character. My own background was quite different from both David and Michelle's. I had grown up in a middle-class family in suburban Portland with parents who emphasized education, hard work, and personal responsibility. My father, Robert, was an accountant, and my mother, Patricia, was a high school English teacher. They had provided a stable, if somewhat predictable, childhood for me and my younger sister. Unlike Michelle's apparent free-spirited nature, I had always been goal-oriented and driven. In high school, I was the student who had 5-year plans and backup plans for my backup plans. I studied business and marketing in college, graduated with honors, and immediately started working for a small marketing firm to gain experience before eventually starting my own consultancy. Building my business had required incredible discipline and sacrifice. For the first 3 years, I reinvested every penny back into the company, living in a tiny studio apartment and eating ramen noodles more often than I care to admit. I worked weekends, holidays, and late into most nights, slowly building my reputation and client base. When I met David, I was finally at a point where my business was thriving and I could afford the lifestyle I had always wanted. I had moved into a nice one-bedroom apartment, could take vacations without worrying about the cost, and was ready to invest time and energy into a serious relationship. David had seemed like the perfect partner for this phase of my life. He was financially stable, emotionally available, and supportive of my career ambitions. Unlike some men I had dated who were intimidated by my success or tried to compete with my achievements, David celebrated my wins and encouraged my goals. Our courtship had been wonderful. David would surprise me with thoughtful gestures, bringing me lunch during particularly busy workdays, researching hiking trails he thought I would enjoy, remembering small details about my clients, and asking how important presentations had gone. He was present and engaged in a way that made me feel truly seen and valued. When we got engaged, both of our families were thrilled. My parents adored David and frequently commented on how well suited we seemed for each other. David's parents, Linda and Frank, welcomed me warmly into their family and often mentioned how much happier David seemed since we had been together. "You have brought out the best in our son," Linda had told me at our engagement party. "He went through such a difficult time during his divorce, and we weren't sure he would ever be himself again. But with you, he's back to being the David we know and love." Even David's friends, most of whom I had met during the divorce proceedings with Michelle, seemed genuinely happy about our relationship. His best friend Marcus had pulled me aside at our wedding reception to say, "I've never seen David this content. Michelle always seemed like she was looking for something else, something more. But with you, he seems complete." These observations from people who knew David well reassured me that our relationship was built on solid ground. We weren't just compatible, we enhanced each other's lives and brought out positive qualities in one another. Our first year of marriage had reinforced this belief. We navigated the typical adjustments of newlywed life with relatively few conflicts. David was respectful of my need for quiet workspace when I worked from home. I was understanding when his job required occasional evening calls or weekend troubleshooting. We split household responsibilities fairly, made financial decisions together, and maintained our individual friendships while building a shared social circle. The house in Hillcrest had been a joint decision that reflected our shared values in future plans. We had spent months looking at properties, discussing neighborhoods, and envisioning how we would use each space. The guest room had been designated specifically for hosting family and friends. My parents, when they visited from Seattle. David's college roommate, who came to town for business. My sister, during her job interview in Portland. We had decorated that room together, choosing a comfortable queen bed, a small desk, and artwork that would make guests feel welcome. It was meant to be a space for people we cared about to stay temporarily while visiting our city or during special occasions. Never in our discussions about that room had we imagined it becoming a long-term residence for David's ex-wife. The very idea would have seemed absurd to both of us just 6 months earlier. But, as I would soon learn, sometimes the foundations we think are solid can shift dramatically when tested by unexpected circumstances. And Michelle's arrival would test not just our marriage, but everything I thought I knew about the man I had married and the life we had built together. The warning signs were subtle at first, so subtle that I dismissed them as normal adjustment anxiety. But looking back, I can see that the problems began almost immediately after Michelle walked through our front door with those 2 large suitcases and her promise to be the perfect houseguest. Michelle's first few days in our house seemed to confirm David's assurances that she would be a considerate temporary guest. She kept to herself mostly, spending time in the guest room with her laptop, occasionally emerging to make herself a simple meal or exchange pleasantries with David and me. She was polite, thankful, and seemingly making genuine efforts to find employment and her own housing. I've already submitted applications to 3 marketing companies, she told me on her 3rd day, while we both happened to be in the kitchen at the same time. And I'm looking at several apartment listings. Hopefully, I'll be out of your hair within the week. I appreciated her proactive approach and began to relax about the arrangement. Maybe my initial discomfort had been unfounded jealousy or unnecessary territorial feelings about my home. Michelle seemed genuinely motivated to regain her independence, and David appeared to have been right about her character. But by the end of the first week, small things began to shift in ways that made me increasingly uncomfortable. It started with the coffee. David and I had a specific morning routine that worked perfectly for both our schedules. We would wake up around 6:30, and David would make coffee while I showered first. Then I would handle breakfast while he showered, and we'd eat together before heading to our respective jobs. It was simple, efficient, and one of those small daily rituals that made us feel connected as a couple. Michelle began joining us for these morning routines. At first, it seemed natural enough. She was staying in our house, she needed coffee, and it would have been rude to exclude her. But there was something about her presence that changed the entire dynamic of our mornings. She would appear in the kitchen in pajama pants and an oversized t-shirt, hair perfectly tousled in that effortless way that actually requires effort. She had a throaty morning voice that she used to make casual observations about the weather, the news, or memories from when she and David used to wake up together. "Remember how you used to burn the toast every single morning?" She'd laugh, watching David prepare breakfast. "I swear it, you set the toaster to incinerate setting every time." David would chuckle and respond with his own memories. "You weren't much better with that ancient coffee maker we had. Half the time it would overflow all over the counter." These exchanges felt intimate in a way that made me profoundly uncomfortable. They were sharing private domestic memories from their marriage, laughing about inside jokes I couldn't participate in, creating a warm bubble of familiarity that I was clearly outside of.
When I tried to join the conversation, my comments seemed to fall flat or interrupt the flow between them. I began feeling like an outsider in my own kitchen, during my own morning routine, with my own husband. Maybe we should give Michelle some space in the mornings, I suggested to David privately after about 10 days of this. Let her have the kitchen to herself sometimes so she doesn't feel like she's intruding on our time together. David looked at me with surprise. She's not intruding. It's nice having someone to talk to in the mornings. Besides, it would be rude to exclude her from the common areas of the house. His response bothered me more than Michelle's presence had. The fact that he didn't seem to understand or acknowledge my discomfort felt like a small betrayal. This was our home, our routine, our marriage. Shouldn't my feelings about these changes take priority over making his ex-wife comfortable? But I didn't push the issue. I told myself I was being petty and possessive. Michelle was going through a difficult time, and David was being compassionate. I should be supportive of his kindness, not threatened by it. The second major shift happened around Michelle's job search. Initially, she had seemed motivated and focused on finding employment quickly. She would spend hours in the guest room on her laptop, and when asked about her progress, she always had updates about applications submitted and interviews scheduled. But after 2 weeks, the original timeline for her stay, it became clear that her job search wasn't progressing as quickly as anyone had hoped. The market is just really tough right now, Michelle explained when David asked about her timeline for moving out. I've had a few promising leads, but nothing concrete yet. I might need another week or two to find the right opportunity. David immediately agreed to extend her stay. Of course! Take as much time as you need. There's no rush. I was standing right there during this conversation, but neither of them consulted me or even looked in my direction while making this decision about my home and my life. It was as if my opinion was irrelevant, as if David and Michelle were the decision makers and I was simply expected to go along with whatever they determined. That night, I tried to discuss the situation with David privately. I thought we agreed on 2 weeks. It's been 2 weeks, and now we're extending indefinitely?
It's not indefinitely, David replied. Just a little longer until she finds the right job. You know how tough the job market can be. Remember how long it took you to build your client base when you started your business? The comparison stung. Yes, building my business had taken time, but I had been supporting myself throughout that process. I hadn't been living rent-free in someone else's home, disrupting their marriage and routine. This is different, David. I was living in my own apartment and paying my own bills while building my business. Michelle is a grown woman who should have some savings or other options besides living with her ex-husband and his new wife. David's expression hardened slightly. She's not just some random person, Rachel. She's someone I cared about for 5 years. She's going through a rough time, and we're in a position to help. I thought you understood that. The conversation ended there, but the tension between us was palpable. I felt like David was choosing Michelle's comfort over my concerns, and I couldn't understand why my feelings as his wife weren't his priority. Over the following days, Michelle's behavior became increasingly comfortable and familiar in ways that crossed boundaries I didn't even know I had. She began doing laundry without asking, mixing her clothes with ours in loads. She rearranged items in the refrigerator to make room for groceries she had purchased. She started answering our home phone when David and I weren't available. Most troubling of all, she began inserting herself into conversations and decisions that should have been private between David and me. When we were discussing plans for a weekend hiking trip, Michelle would offer suggestions about trails she and David had enjoyed during their marriage. When I mentioned a work challenge I was facing, she would share advice based on her various job experiences. When David and I were trying to decide on a restaurant for date night, Michelle would recommend places she knew David loved. She wasn't overtly inappropriate or hostile. In fact, she was unfailingly polite and helpful. But her presence was becoming so integrated into our daily life that the boundaries between guest and resident, between past and present, were becoming increasingly blurred. 3 weeks into her stay, I woke up one morning to find Michelle and David in deep conversation in the kitchen. They were sitting closer together than necessary,
speaking in low voices, and when I entered the room, they both looked up with slightly guilty expressions. Just catching up on old friends, David explained quickly. Michelle was telling me about some mutual acquaintances from her time in California. But something about the way they had been sitting, the intimacy of their conversation, and their reaction to my presence made me realize that Michelle's temporary stay was becoming something much more complicated and threatening than any of us had originally anticipated. That was the morning I first understood that my marriage was in serious trouble. The fourth week of Michelle's temporary stay marked a turning point where her behavior shifted from mildly inappropriate to openly territorial. It was as if she had been testing boundaries for the first 3 weeks, and having encountered minimal resistance, she now felt emboldened to claim her space in our home and our lives more aggressively. The first major incident happened on a Saturday morning when I was working in my home office, preparing for a crucial client presentation scheduled for Monday. I had told David that I needed the morning to focus and asked him to keep the house quiet. This was a routine request that he had always respected and supported throughout our marriage. Around 10 a.m., I heard laughter echoing from the kitchen, followed by the unmistakable sound of music playing. I tried to ignore it initially, but the noise grew louder and more distracting. Finally, I went upstairs to find David and Michelle cooking what appeared to be an elaborate brunch together. They had ingredients spread across every counter surface, multiple pans going on the stove, and jazz music playing from David's Bluetooth speaker. "Hey, babe," David called cheerfully when he saw me. "Michelle suggested we make those stuffed French toast things we used to love. Want to join us?" The casual use of "we" to refer to him and Michelle, combined with his apparent obliviousness to my work needs, sent a spike of irritation through me. But it was Michelle's response that truly caught my attention. "Oh, I'm sorry, Rachel," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't realize you were working. David and I were just reminiscing about our old Sunday brunch traditions, and I guess we got carried away." There was something deliberately pointed about the way she emphasized our old traditions, as if she were reminding me that she had a history with David that I could never share or compete with. And the way she positioned herself as the one to apologize, rather than David, made it seem like she was taking responsibility for his actions, a dynamic that felt uncomfortably intimate and coupled. "I did mention I needed quiet to work this morning," I said, looking directly at David. "Right, sorry," David replied, but he made no move to turn off the music or lower their voices. "We'll try to keep it down." I returned to my office, but the damage was done. I couldn't concentrate on my presentation with the continued sounds of their cooking and conversation above me. More importantly, I was deeply disturbed by David's casual dismissal of my clearly stated needs and his apparent amnesia about our established household routines when work was involved. Later that evening, I tried to address the situation with David privately. This morning was really difficult for me. I had specifically asked for quiet time to work, and instead, the house was louder than usual. David's reply was defensive rather than apologetic. "We were just making breakfast, Rachel. It's not like we were throwing a party." "Maybe you're being a little oversensitive about noise." "It's not just about the noise, David. It's about the fact that you completely ignored my request and prioritized cooking with Michelle over supporting my work needs." "That's not fair," David shot back. "Michelle suggested making brunch as a way to contribute to the household. She was trying to be helpful and nice. I don't understand why you're making this into a big deal." Once again, I felt like David was defending Michelle's actions rather than acknowledging my concerns. The pattern was becoming clear. Any conflict between Michelle's desires and my needs was being resolved in her favor, with David positioning me as the unreasonable one for objecting. The second major escalation occurred during week 5, when I came home from work to find that Michelle had rearranged our living room furniture. She had moved our couch to a different angle, relocated several decorative items, and even hung a piece of artwork that I had never seen before, apparently something she had brought from California but hadn't displayed until now. "I hope you don't mind," Michelle said when I stood in the doorway staring at our transformed living space. "I was feeling a bit restless today and thought the room could use some fresh energy. I used to be pretty good at interior design back in the day." The casual way she had taken it upon herself to redecorate our primary living space was breathtaking in its presumption. This wasn't her home. She was a temporary guest, yet she had felt comfortable making permanent changes to our shared space without consulting either David or me. When David came home and saw the changes, his reaction shocked me even more than Michelle's actions had. "Wow, this looks great," he said enthusiastically. "I never would have thought to angle the couch that way, but it really opens up the room." He spent several minutes praising Michelle's design choices and discussing her aesthetic vision with her. Not once did he acknowledge that she had made these changes without permission, or ask how I felt about having our living space altered without consultation.
That night, I confronted David about the furniture situation. "She rearranged our living room without asking us," I said. "Doesn't that seem inappropriate for a house guest?" "She was trying to help," David replied. "And honestly, it does look better. Michelle always had a good eye for design. I think you're reading too much into this." "David, she moved our furniture around like she lives here permanently. She hung her own artwork on our walls. That's not normal guest behavior." "Maybe you're just not used to having someone else in the house," David suggested. "It's been just the two of us for so long. Having another person around naturally means some adjustments." His willingness to normalize Michelle's boundary-crossing behavior while dismissing my discomfort as an adjustment problem made me feel increasingly isolated in my own marriage. I began to wonder if David even saw Michelle as a temporary guest anymore, or if he had unconsciously started thinking of her as a permanent member of our household. The situation deteriorated further when Michelle began involving herself in our financial discussions. During week 6, David and I were having a conversation about refinancing our mortgage to take advantage of lower interest rates. It was a complex financial decision that we had been researching for months, and we were finally ready to move forward with applications. Michelle, who was sitting at the kitchen counter with her laptop, suddenly chimed in with advice about different lenders and rate options. She spoke with authority about mortgage products and refinancing strategies, and David listened to her input as if she were a financial advisor rather than a house guest with no stake in our property decisions. "Michelle actually went through a refinancing process a few years ago," David told me later, as if this qualified her to participate in our private financial planning. "She had some really good insights about different loan products." "David, our mortgage decisions are private between us. Michelle shouldn't be part of those conversations." "She was just trying to be helpful. She has relevant experience, and it's not like she's trying to influence our decision for her own benefit." But I could see exactly what Michelle was doing. By inserting herself into intimate aspects of our life, our daily routines, our home decor, our financial planning, she was gradually positioning herself not as a temporary guest, but as a permanent part of our household dynamic. She was creating a new normal where her presence and opinions were integrated into every aspect of our marriage. Most troubling of all, David seemed not only oblivious to this manipulation, but actively supportive of it. Every time I raised concerns, he framed Michelle's behavior as helpful and my objections as unreasonable. I was starting to feel like a stranger in my own home and my own marriage. By the end of 6 weeks, I realized that Michelle had no intention of leaving, and David had no intention of setting boundaries or enforcing the temporary nature of her stay. The 2-week arrangement had become an indefinite living situation, and I was powerless to change it without appearing like the villain who was throwing a struggling woman out on the street. I needed help, and I needed perspective from someone outside this increasingly toxic situation. Carmen Rodriguez had been my best friend since college, and she was the one person I knew would give me honest feedback without sugarcoating the truth. We had maintained our friendship through career changes, relationships, and life transitions, and she had always been my voice of reason during difficult times. I desperately needed her perspective on what was happening in my marriage. I called Carmen on a Thursday evening during week 7 of Michelle's stay, after David had gone to bed and Michelle was presumably asleep in the guest room. I found myself whispering into the phone, which immediately struck me as absurd. Why was I hiding in my own home to have a private conversation with my best friend? Carmen, I began, and then found myself pouring out 6 weeks of accumulated frustration, confusion, and growing resentment. Carmen listened without interrupting as I described Michelle's gradual takeover of our morning routines, her furniture rearrangement project, her insertion into our financial discussions, and most concerning of all, David's consistent defense of her behavior while dismissing my concerns. Rachel, Carmen said when I finally finished, this woman is not a house guest. She's moving in on your marriage, and your husband is letting her do it. Hearing someone else articulate what I had been feeling but couldn't quite name was both validating and terrifying. But David says she's just trying to be helpful and I'm being oversensitive. Honey, listen to yourself. You're whispering in your own house because you don't feel comfortable having a private conversation with my best friend. That's not normal. None of this is normal. Carmen's directness cut through the confusion I had been feeling. What would you do if you were in my situation? I would give David an ultimatum, Carmen replied without hesitation. Either Michelle goes or you go. A marriage can't survive 3 people in it, and right now, you're the third wheel in your own relationship. The conversation with Carmen clarified something important. I wasn't crazy, oversensitive, or unreasonable. My instincts about Michelle's behavior and David's enabling were correct. But knowing I was right didn't make the situation any easier to navigate. I decided to try one more direct approach with David before considering more drastic measures. The next evening, I asked him to take a walk with me, something we used to do regularly, but had stopped doing since Michelle's arrival. I wanted to have this conversation away from the house, away from Michelle's potential eavesdropping. David, we need to talk about Michelle's living situation, I began as we walked through our neighborhood. It's been 7 weeks now, and there's no end date in sight. This is affecting our marriage. David's response was immediate and defensive. She's actively looking for work, Rachel. It's not her fault the job market is competitive. She's not sitting around doing nothing. That's not my point. My point is that having your ex-wife living in our house indefinitely is not sustainable for our relationship. I feel like I don't have privacy in my own home. What privacy are you lacking? David asked, and his genuine confusion made me realize how differently we were experiencing the situation. David, she's there during all our personal conversations. She comments on our plans, our decisions, our routines. When was the last time you and I had dinner alone together? When was the last time we had a morning to ourselves without her joining us for coffee? She's just being social. It would be rude to exclude her from meals and conversations. She's going through a difficult time, and isolating her would be cruel. I stopped walking and turned to face him. What about what I'm going through? What about what this is doing to our marriage? David's expression softened slightly, but his words remained firm. I thought you were stronger than this, Rachel. I thought you could handle a temporary inconvenience to help someone in need. The phrase temporary inconvenience felt like a slap. 7 weeks of feeling like a stranger in my own home, of being my concerns dismissed, of watching my husband prioritize his ex-wife's comfort over our marriage? That wasn't an inconvenience. That was a fundamental shift in our relationship dynamic. How long is temporary, David? Because Michelle hasn't found a job, hasn't found an apartment, and hasn't given us any timeline for leaving. For all we know, this could go on for months or even years. Don't be dramatic, David. She'll find something soon. And in the meantime, we're doing the right thing by helping her. That conversation ended with no resolution and a growing chasm between us. David seemed incapable of understanding my perspective, and I was beginning to realize that his loyalty to Michelle might be stronger than his commitment to our marriage. The situation deteriorated rapidly after that. Michelle seemed to sense that I was becoming more resistant to her presence, and her behavior became more deliberately provocative. She began wearing increasingly revealing clothing around the house.
Short pajama sets, low-cut tops, tight yoga pants that she wore while doing stretching routines in our living room when David was present. She also started touching David more frequently. Casual hand on his shoulder when she passed behind his chair, playful nudges when they shared inside jokes, brief hugs that lasted just a moment too long. None of these gestures were overtly sexual, but they created an atmosphere of intimacy that excluded me and made me deeply uncomfortable in my own home. Most disturbing of all, Michelle began sharing increasingly personal details about their past marriage, often in front of me. She would reminisce about vacations they had taken together, inside jokes they shared, romantic dinners at restaurants I had never been to. These conversations served no purpose except to remind everyone present that she and David had a shared history that I could never be part of. "Remember that little bed and breakfast we stayed at in Mendocino?" she said one evening while we were all watching television together. "That place with the fireplace in the room and the amazing view of the ocean?" David smiled nostalgically. "That was a great weekend. The weather was perfect, and we spent the whole time just walking on the beach and reading." I felt like an unwelcome observer to an intimate moment between two people who clearly still cared for each other. The fact that they were having this conversation in front of me suggested either complete thoughtlessness or deliberate cruelty. When I tried to express my discomfort to David later, he accused me of being jealous of his past. I can't erase the fact that Michelle and I were married. We have shared memories, and it's natural that we would sometimes talk about them. You're being unreasonable by expecting us to pretend our history doesn't exist. But it wasn't about erasing history. It was about appropriate boundaries in our current situation. Reminiscing about romantic getaways with an ex-wife while she's living in your marital home isn't normal or healthy behavior. By week 8, I had developed chronic headaches from stress, was having trouble sleeping, and had lost my appetite. My work was suffering because I couldn't concentrate, and several clients had commented that I seemed distracted during meetings. My health, my career, and my marriage were all deteriorating because of Michelle's presence in our home. I realized I needed more than Carmen's advice. I needed professional help to navigate the situation and protect my sanity and my marriage. The next day, I called Dr. Sarah Rivera, a marriage counselor that Carmen had recommended, and scheduled an emergency appointment. It was time to get serious about saving my marriage, even if David wasn't willing to participate in that effort. Dr. Sarah Rivera's office was a calming space with soft lighting and comfortable chairs, but I felt anything but calm as I sat across from her during my first appointment. I had never been to therapy before, and I wasn't entirely sure how to begin explaining the complex web of manipulation and boundary violations that had taken over my life. "Tell me what brought you here today," Dr. Rivera said gently, and I found myself breaking down as I described the past 8 weeks of my marriage. Dr. Rivera listened attentively, taking occasional notes and asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Rachel, what you're describing is a form of emotional manipulation called triangulation. Michelle is inserting herself into your marriage and creating alliance with your husband that excludes you. This is a deliberate strategy, whether conscious or unconscious, to destabilize your relationship." Having a professional name for what I was experiencing felt validating, but also frightening. How do I stop it? The concerning part is that this manipulation only works if your husband participates in it. Michelle can't triangulate your marriage without David's cooperation. His willingness to prioritize her comfort over your concerns is the real problem here. This insight hit me like a physical blow. I had been focusing so much on Michelle's behavior that I hadn't fully grasped how David's responses were enabling and escalating the situation. "I want to save my marriage," I told Dr. Rivera, "but I don't know how to get David to see what's happening." "You can't control David's choices," she replied, "but you can control your own responses and boundaries. The question is, what are you willing to accept, and what are you willing to do to protect yourself?"
I left that session with homework to document specific incidents of boundary violations and to consider what ultimatums I might be prepared to give David. Dr. Rivera emphasized that I needed to be ready to follow through on any boundaries I set, which meant being prepared for the possibility that David might choose Michelle over our marriage. Unfortunately, I didn't have to wait long for more incidents to document. That very weekend, Michelle crossed a line that even David couldn't completely ignore. I had been planning an intimate dinner party for David's birthday, just the two of us with his favorite meal and a special bottle of wine I had been saving. I had mentioned this plan to David weeks earlier, and we had both been looking forward to a romantic evening together. On Friday afternoon, I left work early to begin preparations. I stopped at the gourmet market for ingredients, picked up fresh flowers, and even bought new candles to create the perfect ambiance. When I got home around 3 p.m., I found Michelle in the kitchen with her own shopping bags, apparently having had the same idea. "Oh," she said when she saw me, "I thought I'd surprise David by making his birthday dinner. I know all his favorites from when we were married." She had already begun food preparation, with ingredients spread across the counters and multiple dishes in progress. The kitchen smelled like garlic and herbs, and she was clearly deep into executing an elaborate meal plan. "Michelle, I already planned to make David's birthday dinner. I've been planning this for weeks." "Oh, I'm sorry," but she made no move to stop her cooking or put away her ingredients. "I just thought it would be nice to do something special for him. Maybe we could cook together. I could show you how to make his favorite pasta sauce. It's a family recipe from his grandmother." The audacity of her suggestion was breathtaking. She was offering to teach me how to cook for my own husband, using recipes from his family that she had learned during their marriage. She was positioning herself as the expert on David's preferences, and me as the student who needed her guidance. This was supposed to be a private dinner for David and me. It's his birthday, and I want to celebrate with just my husband. Michelle's expression shifted slightly, revealing a flash of something that looked like anger before returning to her innocent smile. "Of course, I understand. I just thought, since I'm staying here, it would be weird for me to hide in my room while you two have dinner, but if that's what you want..." She trailed off, making it sound like I was being unreasonably cruel by wanting privacy with my husband on his birthday. But I held firm. "Yes, that's what I want. David and I need time alone together." Michelle shrugged and began putting away her ingredients with exaggerated disappointment. "Well, I guess I'll find something else to do tonight. Maybe I'll go to a movie by myself." When David came home and learned about the conflict, his reaction was exactly what I had begun to expect and dread. "You made Michelle feel unwelcome on my birthday?" he asked incredulously. "She was trying to do something nice for me, and you shut her down." "David, I planned this dinner weeks ago. I wanted to have a romantic evening alone with my husband on his birthday. That's not unreasonable."
But now Michelle feels excluded and hurt. She's going to spend my birthday alone at a movie theater because you couldn't include her in our celebration. She could have asked before starting to cook. She could have checked with us before assuming she'd be part of our dinner plans. David shook his head. "I can't believe you're being so territorial about this. It's just dinner, Rachel." "It's not just dinner, David. It's our marriage. When was the last time we did anything alone together? When was the last time we had a conversation that Michelle wasn't part of?" That evening, we had our romantic dinner, but the mood was completely ruined by the conflict and David's obvious guilt about excluding Michelle. He kept mentioning how bad he felt that she was alone, and he cut the evening short to check on her when she returned from her movie. The pattern was becoming clear. Any attempt I made to preserve space for our marriage was met with guilt, resistance, and accusations that I was being selfish or cruel to Michelle. But it was what happened the following Tuesday that finally pushed me to my absolute breaking point. I came home from work to find Michelle wearing one of my dresses. Not just any dress, but the emerald green wrap dress that David had bought me for our first anniversary, a meaningful, personal gift that represented our love and commitment to each other. She was standing in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting the fit and admiring herself. When she saw me, She smiled brightly. I hope you don't mind. I have a job interview tomorrow, and I realized I don't have anything appropriate to wear. David said you probably wouldn't mind if I borrowed something. The violation felt physical. This wasn't just about clothes. It was about Michelle literally wearing symbols of my marriage, with David's permission, without consulting me. That's my anniversary dress, I said, my voice shaking with anger. Oh, is it special? Michelle asked with false innocence. David didn't mention that when he said I could borrow it. But it looks really good on me, don't you think? We're about the same size. When I confronted David about giving Michelle permission to wear my anniversary dress without asking me, his response was the final confirmation that I had lost my husband to his ex-wife. It's just a dress, Rachel. She needed something professional for her interview, and you have plenty of nice clothes. I thought you'd want to help her succeed in finding a job so she can move out. David, you gave her permission to wear the dress you bought me for our anniversary. How can you not see how inappropriate that is? You're making this into a bigger deal than it needs to be. Michelle is trying to get back on her feet, and we should be supporting her efforts, not making her feel bad about needing help. That night, I called Dr. Rivera's emergency line. I knew I needed professional guidance before I did something that would irreparably damage my marriage or my sanity. I think I'm ready to give David an ultimatum, but I'm scared of what his answer might be.
Dr. Rivera's advice during our emergency phone session was both empowering and terrifying. Rachel, you've reached a point where protecting your mental health and self-respect requires decisive action. You need to be prepared to follow through on whatever ultimatum you give David, which means being ready for the possibility that he might choose Michelle over your marriage. The thought of my marriage ending was devastating, but the thought of continuing to live as a third wheel in my own home was becoming unbearable. I spent the next 2 days carefully planning what I would say to David and preparing myself emotionally for his potential response. I also took Dr. Rivera's advice and began documenting everything. I wrote down dates, specific incidents, and David's responses to my concerns. The pattern was even more disturbing when I saw it laid out chronologically, a clear progression from small boundary violations to major betrayals, with David consistently choosing Michelle's comfort over our marriage. On Thursday evening, I asked David to meet me at a coffee shop near our house. I wanted to have this conversation in public, partly to keep us both calm, and partly because I no longer felt comfortable having serious discussions in our home where Michelle might overhear and insert herself into the situation. David, I need to tell you something important, I began once we were seated with our drinks. Our marriage is in serious trouble, and I don't think you realize how serious. David's expression immediately became defensive. If this is about Michelle again, it is about Michelle, but it's really about us. It's about the fact that you've consistently prioritized her needs and feelings over mine for the past 2 months. It's about the fact that I feel like a stranger in my own home and my own marriage. I pulled out the notebook where I had documented the incidents and began reading specific examples. David's face grew increasingly uncomfortable as I recounted his dismissal of my work needs, his defense of Michelle's furniture rearrangement, his permission for her to wear my anniversary dress, and dozens of other boundary violations. When you see it all together like this, I said, can you understand why I feel like you're choosing her over me? David was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued. I didn't realize it had gotten so extensive. I was just trying to be helpful to someone in need. David, I need you to understand something. Michelle is not just someone in need. She's your ex-wife, and she's actively working to insert herself back into your life in ways that are destroying our marriage. That's not true, David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Michelle isn't trying to break us up. She's just going through a hard time. David, look at me, I said firmly. In the past 2 months, when have you and I been alone together? When have we had a conversation that Michelle wasn't part of? When have we made a decision about our home or our life without her input? As David struggled to answer these questions, I could see the realization beginning to dawn on him.
But his next words showed me that understanding the problem and being willing to fix it were two different things. So what do you want me to do? Throw her out on the street? She has nowhere else to go, Rachel. Her family lives across the country, she doesn't have savings for a deposit on an apartment, and she hasn't found a job yet. David, those are Michelle's problems to solve, not ours. She's a grown woman who made choices that led to her current situation. We are not responsible for fixing her life. She's not some stranger, Rachel. We were married for 5 years. I can't just turn my back on her when she needs help. This was the moment I realized that David's sense of obligation to Michelle was deeper and more problematic than I had understood. He wasn't just being compassionate. He was still emotionally connected to her in ways that made it impossible for him to prioritize our marriage. David, I need you to make a choice, I said, my heart pounding. Michelle needs to leave our house, and we need to rebuild our marriage without her interference. Or I'm going to leave. The words hung in the air between us like a bomb that had finally exploded. David stared at me with shock and something that looked like anger. You're giving me an ultimatum? You're asking me to choose between helping someone I care about and staying married to you? I'm asking you to choose between your ex-wife and your current wife. And the fact that you're framing it as an impossible choice tells me everything I need to know about where your loyalties lie. David's face flushed red. This is emotional blackmail, Rachel. You're forcing me to be cruel to Michelle just to prove my love for you. No, David. I'm asking you to set appropriate boundaries with your ex-wife to protect our marriage. The fact that you see boundary setting as cruelty is exactly the problem. We sat in tense silence for several minutes. Finally, David spoke, and his words shattered what was left of my hope for our marriage.
I need time to think about this, he said. I can't just kick Michelle out overnight. She needs time to find somewhere else to go. How much time? I asked. I don't know, a few weeks, maybe a month, just enough time for her to get settled somewhere else. I felt something inside me break. After everything I had explained, after laying out how Michelle's presence was destroying our marriage, David was still prioritizing her needs over mine. He was asking me to endure more weeks or months of the same dynamic that had already pushed me to my breaking point. David, it's been 9 weeks already. Every week you give her is another week of damage to our marriage. I can't do this anymore. Rachel, please be reasonable. I'm not saying no to your concerns. I'm just asking for a little more time to handle this in a way that's fair to everyone. But there was no way to be fair to everyone in this situation. Being fair to Michelle meant continuing to sacrifice my marriage and my sanity. Being fair to our marriage meant setting firm boundaries that Michelle wouldn't like. I need your answer now, David, tonight. Either Michelle leaves this weekend or I do. David's response confirmed that I had already lost my husband long before this conversation began. I can't do that to her, Rachel. I'm sorry, but I can't just throw her out with nowhere to go. If you can't be patient for a few more weeks while I help her find a solution, then maybe we both need to reconsider what we want from this marriage. The coffee shop suddenly felt suffocating. I gathered my things and stood up from the table. I have my answer, I said quietly. I'll be staying at Carmen's house starting tonight. When you're ready to put our marriage first, you know how to reach me. As I walked away from David sitting alone at that coffee shop table, I felt both devastated and relieved. My marriage was over, at least temporarily, but for the first time in 2 months, I was choosing myself over the impossible situation that had consumed my life. The hardest part was that David let me walk away without fighting for us.
Carmen's spare bedroom became my refuge for the next 3 weeks, though refuge might be too gentle a word for what I was experiencing. I felt like I was in emotional freefall, devastated by the collapse of my marriage, but also experiencing a strange sense of clarity that I hadn't felt in months. You did the right thing, Carmen assured me repeatedly during those first few difficult days. David showed you exactly where his priorities were, and it wasn't with you. The hardest part was that David barely contacted me during the first week of our separation. A few text messages asking about practical matters, bills that needed to be paid, a client who had called the house looking for me, but no real attempt to discuss our relationship or fight for our marriage. It was Michelle who finally forced the confrontation that changed everything. On a Tuesday evening, exactly 3 weeks after I had moved out, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. When I answered, Michelle's voice was on the other end, and she sounded different, harder, more confident, almost triumphant. "Rachel, we need to talk," she said without preamble. "I don't think we have anything to discuss, Michelle." "Oh, but we do. See, I think there are some things you should know about David and me, and about what's really been happening these past few months." There was something in her tone that made my stomach clench with dread. "What are you talking about?" "Meet me at Riverside Park tomorrow at 2 p.m. Come alone. There are some things I need to tell you about your husband that you deserve to know." Every instinct told me not to go, but curiosity and a desperate need to understand what had destroyed my marriage overrode my better judgment. The next day, I found Michelle sitting on a bench overlooking the Willamette River, looking more relaxed and confident than I had ever seen her before. "Thank you for coming," she said as I approached. "I wasn't sure you would. What do you want, Michelle?" She smiled, and for the first time, I saw something calculating and cruel in her expression. "I want to tell you the truth about why I came back to Portland. You said you lost your job and couldn't afford your apartment in California." "I lied," Michelle said simply. "I mean, those things happened, but they weren't why I came back. I came back because I wanted David back." The words hit me like a physical blow, but part of me had suspected this truth for weeks. "You've been trying to break up our marriage." "I didn't have to try very hard," Michelle replied with a shrug. "David never really got over me, Rachel. When I left him, it wasn't because we didn't love each other. It was because I wasn't ready to settle down. But after 3 years of dating other people and living in different cities, I realized that David was the best thing that ever happened to me. So you decided to destroy my marriage to get him back." I decided to remind David of what we had together. All those shared memories, all those intimate moments, all that history. You can't compete with that, Rachel. You're just the rebound relationship that lasted a little too long. Michelle's casual cruelty was breathtaking, but it was her next revelation that truly shocked me. "The thing is," she continued, "David and I have been talking about getting back together for weeks now. We've been having long conversations about our relationship, about what went wrong the first time, about how we could make it work this time." "You've been having affair conversations with my husband?" "Not an affair," Michelle corrected. "We haven't done anything physical, but we've been emotionally reconnecting, remembering why we loved each other, planning a future together." I felt like I was going to be sick. "David told me he was just being compassionate to someone in need." "David was protecting your feelings," Michelle said. "He didn't want to hurt you unnecessarily while we figured things out. But the truth is, he's been falling back in love with me since the day I arrived." "I don't believe you." Michelle pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages between her and David. The messages were intimate, affectionate, and planning-focused in ways that confirmed everything she was telling me. David had been having an emotional affair with his ex-wife while lying to me about it. One message from David particularly stood out. "I think we can make this work if we take it slow. Rachel is starting to suspect something, but I think she'll accept the situation eventually." "He's been manipulating me," I said, more to myself than to Michelle. "He's been trying to have both of us," Michelle replied. "He wants me back, but he doesn't want to be the bad guy who leaves his wife for his ex. He was hoping you would eventually get tired of the situation and leave on your own." "Which I did. Which you did," Michelle confirmed with satisfaction. "And now David and I can be together without him having to be the villain in the story."
I stared at Michelle, finally seeing her clearly for the first time. She wasn't a victim or someone in need of help. She was a calculating woman who had deliberately engineered the destruction of my marriage,
with David's cooperation. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "You got what you wanted." "Because I want you to stop hoping that David will come back to you," Michelle said bluntly. "He won't. He's made his choice, and it's me. I thought it would be kinder to let you know definitively so you can move on with your life." "Kinder?" I repeated incredulously. "Yes. Now you can stop wasting your time waiting for him to fight for your marriage. You can start your divorce proceedings and find someone who actually wants to be with you." The meeting ended with Michelle walking away, leaving me sitting alone on that park bench with the devastating knowledge that my entire marriage had been built on lies and manipulation. David hadn't been blindly compassionate, he had been deliberately deceptive. That evening, I called Susan Walsh, a divorce attorney that Carmen had recommended. I had been hoping that separation might save my marriage, but Michelle's revelations made it clear that there was no marriage left to save. "I need to file for divorce," I told Susan during our phone consultation, "and I need to protect myself financially. My husband has been having an emotional affair with his ex-wife while she's been living in our marital home." Susan was direct and practical. "Do you have evidence of the affair?" "Text messages that his ex-wife showed me, and I'm sure there's more if we look into phone records and other communications." "Good. In Oregon, adultery doesn't affect property division much, but it can impact spousal support decisions. More importantly, if your husband has been using marital assets to support his ex-wife, we can address that in the settlement." "What about the house?" "If it's marital property that you both contributed to, you'll likely need to either buy him out or sell it and split the proceeds. But given the circumstances, we might be able to argue for a more favorable division." The conversation with Susan made the end of my marriage feel real and final in a way that nothing else had. I was no longer trying to save my relationship. I was trying to extract myself from it with my dignity and financial security intact. The next day, I called David and told him I would be coming to the house to collect more of my belongings. What I found there would provide the final confirmation that my marriage had been over long before I realized it. When I arrived at our house, what used to be our house, David and Michelle were sitting together on the couch I had chosen, looking at what appeared to be apartment listings on a laptop. They were planning their future together in the space that had once been my home. "Rachel," David said, looking guilty but not particularly surprised to see me, "we need to talk." "No, David," I replied calmly, "we really don't. I'll be filing for divorce next week. Have your lawyer contact Susan Walsh." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt powerful and in control of my own life. The divorce proceedings moved faster than I had anticipated, partly because David seemed eager to finalize everything quickly, and partly because the evidence of his emotional affair made certain aspects of the settlement negotiations more straightforward. Susan Walsh proved to be exactly the fierce advocate I needed during this process. "Your husband made several critical mistakes," Susan explained during one of our meetings. "First, he allowed his ex-wife to live in the marital home for months without your genuine consent. Second, he used marital funds to support her during that time. Third, he engaged in an emotional affair while still married to you. All of these factors work in your favor." The financial discovery process revealed even more disturbing information about David's deception. Bank records showed that he had been sending Michelle money for months before she ever moved into our house, payments he had hidden from me and disguised as miscellaneous expenses. He had essentially been financially supporting his ex-wife while lying to me about the nature of their relationship. "He was planning this reconciliation long before Michelle showed up at your door," Susan concluded after reviewing the financial records. "The emergency situation was manufactured to create an opportunity for them to reconnect." This revelation was somehow both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant my entire marriage had been built on lies, but liberating because it removed any lingering guilt I had about ending the relationship. I hadn't destroyed my marriage by being unreasonable or unsupportive. My marriage had been destroyed by David's deception and betrayal.
The property settlement negotiations revealed another layer of David's character that I had never seen before. Despite his obvious guilt and the evidence of his affair, he fought aggressively to keep as much of our shared assets as possible. He hired an expensive attorney and attempted to argue that Michelle's presence in our home had been a purely humanitarian gesture that I had overreacted to. Mr. Thompson's position is that his wife abandoned the marital home without justification. His assistance to his ex-wife was temporary and compassionate, not romantic in nature. Susan's response was swift and decisive. Our client has extensive documentation of inappropriate boundary violations, evidence of emotional adultery, and bank records showing financial support of the ex-wife that was hidden from our client. Mr. Thompson's version of events is contradicted by his own communications and financial records. The mediation process took 3 months, but eventually David's position became untenable. The evidence was too overwhelming, and his lawyer likely advised him that going to trial would only result in a worse outcome for him. We reached a settlement that gave me 70% of our home's equity, which was enough for me to buy out David's share and keep the house if I chose to. I also received a favorable division of our other assets and no obligation to pay any spousal support to David. Most importantly, the settlement included a clause that Michelle could never again live in or have extended stays at the property should David retain any ownership interest. Susan had insisted on this provision, and David's reluctant agreement to it confirmed that he understood how inappropriate the entire situation had been. "You won," Carmen said when I told her about the final settlement terms. "Not just financially, but you won your life back." But the victory felt hollow in many ways. I had won a legal battle, but I had lost a marriage I had believed in and a future I had planned for. The financial settlement was fair, but it couldn't restore the trust that had been broken or the time that had been wasted. The aftermath of the divorce also revealed how David and Michelle's reunion played out, and the information came from an unexpected source: David's best friend, Marcus. Marcus reached out to me about 6 months after the divorce was finalized. We met for coffee, and he was clearly uncomfortable with what he felt compelled to tell me. "I need you to know that a lot of David's friends think he handled this whole situation terribly," Marcus began. "We all liked you, Rachel. You were good for him, and what he did to your marriage was wrong." "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "It means a lot to hear." "But there's something else you should know," Marcus continued. "David and Michelle's reunion isn't going well. They've been fighting constantly, and she's already talking about wanting to move to Los Angeles to pursue some acting opportunities she heard about." According to Marcus, the same issues that had broken up David and Michelle's first marriage were resurfacing quickly in their rekindled relationship. Michelle was restless, uncommitted to building a stable life, and constantly looking for something better elsewhere. David, meanwhile, had apparently expected her to be grateful enough for his sacrifice of our marriage that she would settle down and commit to the domestic life she had rejected before.
David keeps complaining that Michelle isn't the person he remembered, Marcus told me. He says she's selfish and ungrateful and that she doesn't appreciate what he gave up to be with her. This information provided an ironic twist to the whole situation. David had destroyed a stable, loving marriage for a fantasy of rekindling a relationship that had failed for good reasons. He had traded a wife who supported his goals and built a life with him for an ex-wife who had already proven she didn't want the same things he wanted. "He's been asking mutual friends about you," Marcus added reluctantly, "wanting to know how you're doing, whether you're dating anyone, if you ever mention him. And what do you tell him? The truth. That you seem happier and more at peace than you were during the last months of your marriage. That you're thriving in your business and building a new life for yourself." Marcus's visit provided a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. It confirmed that David was experiencing the natural consequences of his choices, while I was genuinely building something better for myself. The house that had once felt violated and uncomfortable became truly mine after the divorce was finalized. I redecorated completely, removing every trace of David and Michelle's presence and creating a space that reflected only my own taste and preferences. I also threw myself into growing my business,
using the energy I had previously spent trying to save my marriage to expand my client base and develop new service offerings. Within a year of the divorce, my revenue had increased by 40%, and I was able to hire 2 additional employees. Dr. Rivera continued to be an important source of support during this transition period. "You've done something remarkable," she told me during one of our sessions. "You recognized a toxic situation, set appropriate boundaries, and chose your own well-being over an unhealthy relationship. That takes tremendous courage." But perhaps the most unexpected outcome of this entire experience was the clarity it gave me about what I actually wanted in a relationship and in life. The pain of David's betrayal taught me to trust my instincts, to prioritize my own needs, and to never again accept treatment that diminished my worth or happiness. I was finally ready to build a new life based on my own values and choices, free from the manipulation and deception that had defined the end of my marriage.
2 years have passed since that rainy Thursday evening when Michelle finally revealed the truth about her intentions and David's betrayal. As I sit in my beautifully renovated home office, looking out at the garden I planted last spring, I can honestly say that my life is better now than it ever was during my marriage. The healing process wasn't linear or easy. There were months when I questioned every decision I had made, wondering if I could have handled the situation differently or saved my marriage through different choices. Dr. Rivera helped me work through the self-doubt and guilt that naturally followed such a profound betrayal. "You didn't destroy your marriage, Rachel," she reminded me repeatedly. "Your marriage was destroyed by your husband's deception and his ex-wife's manipulation. You simply chose to stop participating in a dynamic that was harmful to your mental health and self-respect." The first year after the divorce was focused on practical rebuilding, establishing new routines, growing my business, and creating a home environment that felt peaceful and authentically mine. I removed every piece of furniture that David and I had chosen together, repainted every room, and gradually filled the space with items that reflected only my own taste and preferences. The guest room, which had been the epicenter of so much conflict and manipulation, became my meditation and yoga space. I installed hardwood floors, painted the walls a calming sage green, and filled it with plants and natural light. Transforming that space felt symbolic of reclaiming my entire life from the chaos that Michelle and David had created. My business thrived in ways I hadn't expected. The focus and energy I had previously spent trying to navigate the toxic dynamic in my marriage was redirected toward expanding my client services and developing new marketing strategies. I hired 3 additional employees, moved into a larger office space, and was featured in Portland Business Journal as one of the city's rising entrepreneurs. "You seem like a completely different person," Carmen observed about 18 months after my divorce. "Not just happier, but more confident and decisive. Like, you finally know who you are when you're not trying to accommodate someone else's manipulation." Carmen's observation was accurate. The experience with David and Michelle had taught me to trust my instincts and set firm boundaries from the beginning of any relationship, professional or personal. I no longer second-guessed myself when something felt wrong, and I no longer prioritized other people's comfort over my own well-being. About a year and a half after the divorce, I began dating again. The process was initially intimidating, but I approached it with a clarity about my values and needs that I had never possessed before. I was upfront about my expectations for honesty, communication, and respect. I paid attention to how potential partners treated service workers, talked about their ex-relationships, and responded when I expressed needs or boundaries. I met James at a networking event for small business owners. He was launching a sustainable furniture company, and we initially connected over our shared experience of building businesses from the ground up. What impressed me most about James was his consistency. His actions always matched his words, he communicated directly about his feelings and intentions, and he actively supported my goals without trying to compete with or diminish my success. "I love how passionate you are about your work," James told me early in our relationship. "And I love that you've built something amazing through your own efforts. That's incredibly attractive." The contrast with David couldn't have been more stark. Where David had eventually resented my business success and tried to make me feel guilty for prioritizing my work, James celebrated my achievements and understood that my career was an integral part of who I was.
6 months ago, James and I moved in together, into his house, not mine. We made this decision because my home had become such a sanctuary for me that I wanted to preserve it as my own space while we explored building a life together. James understood and supported this choice, recognizing that my need for personal space was born from traumatic experience, not lack of commitment to our relationship. "I want you to feel completely secure and independent," James told me when we discussed living arrangements. "Your home represents your strength and recovery. I would never want to take that away from you." This level of understanding and respect was something I had never experienced in my marriage with David. James sees my boundaries as healthy rather than problematic, and he actively works to support my sense of security rather than undermining it. As for David and Michelle, their story played out exactly as Marcus had predicted. According to mutual friends, they lasted about 8 months before Michelle decided she wanted to pursue opportunities in Los Angeles. She left David for a second time, and from what I've heard, he was devastated in ways that surpassed even their original divorce.
David apparently tried to contact me several times during that period, sending emails that Carmen screened for me, at my request, and even showing up at my office once. Carmen's summaries of his messages revealed a man who finally understood what he had lost, but far too late to matter. He says he realizes now that you were the best thing that ever happened to him, Carmen told me after reading one of his emails. He wants to apologize and see if there's any possibility of reconciliation. My response was immediate and firm. Please tell him that ship has sailed, and I wish him well in his future relationships. I felt no satisfaction in David's regret, but I also felt no temptation to engage with his attempts at reconciliation. The person who had betrayed me so thoroughly was not someone I could ever trust again, regardless of his newfound appreciation for what we had shared. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that love should never require you to sacrifice your self-respect, your boundaries, or your sense of reality. Healthy relationships enhance your life rather than diminishing it. And partners who truly love you will prioritize your well-being rather than consistently choosing other people's comfort over your needs. I also learned that trusting your instincts is crucial, even when others try to convince you that your feelings are wrong or unreasonable. From the very beginning, I had felt uncomfortable with Michelle's presence in our home and David's responses to my concerns. Those instincts were correct, and I should have trusted them sooner. Today, I'm grateful for the painful experience that taught me these lessons. Without going through the betrayal and manipulation, I might never have developed the self-awareness and boundary-setting skills that now serve me so well in all areas of my life. My advice to anyone facing a similar situation is this: pay attention to your gut feelings, don't accept explanations that don't match observable behavior, and never let anyone convince you that protecting your own well-being is selfish or unreasonable. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who consistently choose others over you, even when those people are family members or spouses. Your peace of mind and self-respect are worth protecting, and you deserve relationships that enhance rather than diminish your life. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with a spouse or family member? How did you know when it was time to prioritize your own well-being over maintaining a relationship? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Thank you for following my journey, and remember, you are worthy of relationships that respect and celebrate who you are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.